Look, I'll not lie to you. In my time, I've rolled home drunk along the same cobbled alleyways where Long John potted about on his peg leg, and I've run in under the same shore batteries that guard the deep channel up to Montego Bay. But if I'm honest, given my choice of pirate strongholds to hole up in, well, you can keep your sun-drenched Barbados beaches. Just let me snuggle down with a plump partridge of a lass and a pint of whole navy to see me through the winter, and it'll be the Scillies every time for me. You see, for some people hereabouts, piracy was simply part and parcel of their everyday life. A cash-in-hand, casual affair, something to be seized on whenever the opportunity presented itself. Pirates from Ireland, Cornwall and Brittany came to Scilly to take full advantage of the passing trade. And what passed for the forces of law and order in this part of the world, the officers and men at Star Fort, well, they weren't exactly enthusiastic in prosecuting the participants. They were too busy participating themselves. It's one of history's little ironies that Charles I made himself hugely unpopular by forcing his subjects to pay a tax called ship money to improve his navy. But then, when the Civil War broke out and he was absolutely desperate for his navy to do the business for him, guess what? Almost to a man, the entire navy went over to his enemies. Naughty sailors. Poor old Chaz was left with nothing more than a raggle-taggle squadron of ships, which, in fairness, did their best over the next decade to do him proud. And did they ever? Long after the king's cause was in ruins and Charles himself had been executed, his navy were the very last people to haul down their colours in the civil wars. And you know something? They did it on this very spot. The war went badly for Charles. He lost his navy, he lost every major port, he lost his capital city, he even lost the war. Oh yes, of course, he lost his head as well. Now, whilst the church bells of London rang out a Roundhead victory, on the Scillies, the die-hard cavaliers fought on in the name of the king's son, the new king, Charles II. Pushed to the very edge of the kingdom, they ensconced themselves in the old Star Fort on St. Mary's. Star Castle became the very last outpost of the Royalist cause. Its governor, Sir John Grenville, found himself here with about 2,000 troops at his back, all of them ready, willing and able to cause as much mischief and mayhem as they possibly could. The only problem was they were a little bit short of supplies. But not really such a problem, because what was left of the King's Navy, and I use the term in its very loosest sense, was down there in the harbour, itching to have a slap at the parliamentarians. So, out they sailed from the Scillies, determined to prey on enemy shipping. Of course, they had a somewhat loose definition of enemy shipping, as any Hollander, Portuguese, Spaniard or French captain unlucky enough to fall in with them would tell you. As far as they were concerned, those boys would be better flying the Jolly Roger at their masthead rather than the King's colours.
It was acts of piracy that brought about the downfall of the Royalists. They couldn't resist the chance of sneaking out of the islands and attacking any passing ship. Unfortunately for them, they happened to capture 2 Dutchmen, and they took the Dutchmen prisoners. The Dutch got messages to Holland, and the Dutch government demanded their restitution. Now that would have been all right, except for Parliament. Parliament for a long time had been happy to leave the Royalists to moulder away. But then they began to think, what might happen next? Perhaps it would be the French come. Perhaps the Spaniards would come. And so they decided to finish off the Royalists in Scilly. They hadn't got any idea of how strong the Royalists were, and the Navy fleet came down, headed by Admiral Blake and Admiral Askew, sometimes called General, because he was in charge of people who were later to become the first Royal Marines. They arrived here, and unfortunately for them, their pilot directed them to an island which he said was Tresco. It was a little island over there called Norwevel, and the Royalists blasted them to pieces. they retreated and decided the only way to take Tresco was to attack under a cover of smoke. So the next day they took all their old cordage, old sails, and built bonfires on the Eastern Isles, on Tian and Norwevel, and literally smoked the island out. Under the cover of the smoke, the Royal Marines landed, took first of all the blockhouse, and then they stormed up the hill, and it was every man for himself as they rushed down for the boats to make their way to St Mary's. Having taken Tresco, but having received a bloody nose, the Parliament was a little bit more careful about St Mary's. And the first thing they did was to build a small fortlet at the southern end of Tresco, just over there, and on this fortlet they put up their largest cannon. Unfortunately, at the test firing, it blew it up into 1,000 pieces. They replaced it and started to bombard, as they thought, this spot where I'm sitting on St Mary's. Unfortunately, however they inclined the cannonballs landed about 50 yards short of St Mary's, which meant that the Royalists could still sneak in and out free from the bombardment. But they persevered, the ships sailed round and round, and eventually the Royalists surrendered and were allowed to march free from the castle.
Now, if only Sir John had kept his head below the parapet, who knows? He might have held out here until the restoration of the monarchy. But he made the fatal mistake of interfering with the financial interests of his political opponents. Look at it from their point of view. A die-hard royalist commander holed up in the Scillies, sure, a right royal pain in the nether regions, but bearable, just. But the moment he starts to look like a pirate who might come between a Puritan and his prophet, oh dear, that sounded the death knell for the king's last outpost. The new Roundhead garrison very sensibly set about refortifying the islands with purpose-built artillery towers. Towers that would keep a careful watch over the comings and goings in this part of the realm. Scilly's days as a pirate base were well and truly over. Do you know, there's no end of back-bar philosophers who'll tell you the game's getting hard. Well, far be it from me to disagree with such eminent thinkers, but the game has always been hard. Life never was easy, especially not for women. I mean, funny creatures, women, in case you hadn't noticed. I mean, history is chock full of stories of those sisters who've struggled against the most appalling difficulties and disadvantages, and yet who've still managed to come out on top. Well, they're stories that would uplift and inspire you. Stories that sing the praises of the triumph of the human spirit in difficult circumstances. But this isn't one of them. This is a story about a woman who is vicious and grasping. You know the sort. The ones who have everything and want more. The ones who always seem to get away with murder. The Killigrews had bought themselves power and influence with ill-gotten gold and Spanish silver. Not that they were any different from any other Elizabethan seafaring family. Watchfully opportunist, ravenously avaricious and totally ruthless. But they'd just been luckier than most. Which is how Lady Killigrew's other half came to be Vice-Admiral of Cornwall, as well as holding a warrant from the Privy Council as the Commissioner for Piracy. An admittedly unusual choice considering that her hubby, Sir John, was the most active pirate in the entire southwest peninsula. In 1582, a Spanish ship battered by gales ran for Falmouth. Knowing it was a notorious nest of pirates, they tied up at the Killigrew's quayside. What could be safer than a berth beneath the guns of the Commissioner for Piracy? Now, can you imagine how Lady Killigrew must have felt when at the end of a long, bleak, bitter day, with the wind driving the sleet in off the Carrick Road straight across her windows, she looked out to find a plump Spanish merchantman bouncing in over the wave tops, coming straight towards her husband's quayside. Oh, this was going to be so easy. With her husband away from Falmouth on business, Lady Kay acted on her own initiative. She made the crew welcome and charmed the owners to such an extent that she persuaded them to go and enjoy themselves for a few days in Penlee, while she and her servants supervised the necessary repairs. Then she sent wine and home-baked pasties aboard for the rest of the crew, and while they caroused, she gathered her servants together and ordered them as carefully, as confidently, and as thoroughly as any man. Perhaps her mother-in-law had long ago shown her how these things were arranged. Years before, the old lady had done almost exactly the same to an unsuspecting German ship. The Killigrew womenfolk played big boys' games, and they played for keeps. The Spanish crew were all safely below decks, snuggled down at the mess table, the remains of their supper scattered across the board. The wine flasks passed from hand to hand. The mood was gentle as the sway and the swell of the ship at the quayside. It was a good meal, a good night in a safe harbour, one to remember, but none of them would, because none of them knew it was their last meal. Above them, Lady Killigrew's servants and henchmen slipped like shadows across the deck, their drawn daggers gleaming in the cold starlight. On Lady Killigrew's orders, the crew were butchered, and then later tossed overboard as the ship was sailed to Ireland. Here, Killigrew associates stripped and dismantled the ship, selling it off piecemeal, and sending back whatever had taken her ladyship's fancy to her house in Falmouth. 2 finely worked leather chairs were earmarked for her, but on reflection she decided to bury them in the garden until the heat was off. But she'd been careless, and it proved fatal. She'd left the owners alive, arrogantly contemptuous of their ability to touch her. She was wrong. They had friends in high places too. She was arrested, tried, and condemned to death. But her husband, as always, managed to grease the right palms. Lady Killigrew was one of your fine ladies in fine Flemish lace. She'd spill blood with less thought than she'd pour wine. And the poor Spanish sailors, well, their lives, they'd weighed less heavily with her than the contents of a purse full of gold. Her servants died in the appalling and agonising death that the law demanded in such cases. But Lady Killigrew, she simply walked away. But she'd learned her lesson. The next time, she'd be more careful. Well, that's fascinating history, says I. Ah, but where's the real pirate, says you? The jewelled waistcoated, puffy-sleeved, silk-shirted, damn the Dagos for cowardly lubbers variety. Well, if he don't go getting your dangly earrings in a twist, my dearios, I'll tell 'ee. Plymouth produced one of the most famous pirates of all time, the king of the pirates, Henry Avery, the man who netted the biggest haul in piratical history.
Captain Avery, as far as we know, was born in Capdown, near Plymouth, and he went on and he rose up through the ranks of the Royal Navy and became a very competent seaman. And in fact, at the age of 36, he'd already commanded a couple of vessels, but then at that time, when he was that age, he found himself first mate of a ship called the Charles. And the Charles and her sister ship, the James, they were sent to Spain to help protect Spanish shipping against the French in the West Indies. And it was there, in the port of Corunna, that Captain Avery, well, no, First Mate Avery, as he was then, decided that he'd had enough of the Royal Navy and that he would go off on his own account. And to go on the account is, of course, what they used to call piracy in those days. He managed to get a lot of men on his side. They decided to mutiny. And so it was that Captain Avery set sail on the greatest piratical voyage of all time. Captain Henry Avery, he sensed that it was in his power to do something really great. I think he had an instinct for it. And at the mouth of the Red Sea, after hanging around for a few days, they saw it appearing on the horizon. Great big sails, a huge ship, the largest ship in the Indian Ocean at that time, the Ganges-i-Sawai, the treasure ship belonging to the great mogul of India himself. And he was the richest man in the entire world. Henry Avery did not even hesitate. He set sail straight towards her in his little frigate. His men probably thought he was completely mad, and he probably was. There was a broadside from the Ganges-i-Sawai which inflicted heavy casualties on Avery and did much damage to the ship and some of the spars. But Avery opened fire with a Royal Naval broadside, well, ex-Royal Naval broadside, that did so much damage to the Ganges-i-Sawai. It brought down the mainmast, it created absolute panic among the crew and the Marines, and straight away Avery brought his ship alongside and they boarded. Now this was a sort of do-or-die attempt, it was all or nothing. And the English pirates were so ferocious and fierce in their attack that the Indians on board, including the 600 Marines, didn't stand a chance.
Now, many's a pirate found himself blundering about a captured ship with his boarding spike, only to discover that the thing had a cargo of overripe fish heads, and the treasure chest down below only contained a handful of demand notices from the VAT office in Valparaiso. But Long Ben Avery, when he ran down the Ganges-Sawai in the Indian Ocean, well, him and his chums just couldn't believe their luck. They netted over £500,000 of gold and silver.
It is said that there were about 534,000 pieces of gold, about the same amount of pieces of 8, louis d'or, Venetian check queens, all these old currencies. But there was also gold and silver ingots. There were treasure chests full of emeralds, diamonds, rubies, sapphires. There were bales of silk. There were casks full of precious spices. And of course there were slave girls who were worth quite a lot in themselves. In all, the amount was absolutely staggering. It was the greatest robbery in the history of robberies, the greatest theft of all time, exceeding even the amount taken at the Brinksmat bullion robbery. He even offered to pay off the national debt for Queen Anne in exchange for a free pardon. So I think we can pretty certainly say that he was the king of the pirates.
The reason behind such an extravagant offer was simple. The government and the East India Company had put a £1,500 price on his head, and Avery wanted to buy a pardon. This was how the game was played. Successful pirates simply bought respectability. But Avery had upset the powerful trading interests of the company, and there were no deals on the table for anyone who did that. Though many of his men returned to England and were eventually captured and hung out to dry at Execution Dock, they never captured Long Ben, And Defoe's tale of him returning to Devon, being ripped off by his business backers and then dying in poverty, just strike me as the wishful thinking of a hack with a moral to make at the end of his tale. Now, of course, that's only a story put about by Daniel Defoe, admittedly a journalist of some note, so you might want to believe what he has to say. You might also want to believe that I am actually the Tsarina Anastasia, and that Elvis is alive and well and running a small tea shop in Trebarwith. Get real. Do you really think that one of the world's most successful pirates ever is going to calmly and trustingly hand over all his hard-earned loot to a bunch of Bristol businessmen in sharp suits who then toddle off with the promise to fax him just as soon as they've managed to fence the swag? I don't think so, somehow. No, I think that was a story that Avery and his associates put about to cover their tracks. Whatever else may have happened to Avery in later life, I don't for a minute believe that he died in penury. Or anywhere else in Cornwall, for that matter. The king of the pirates got away scot-free. Now, wealthy, respectable folk were scandalised by this and clung to stories like Defoe's because a bad lad might escape the law, but he could never escape justice, surely. But the poorer sort, the sort whom life had dealt a bad hand in a rigged game, they lapped up tales of Avery's success on the high seas. Do you know, at the end of the day, I would love to think that Henry Avery was one of the few pirates that really did get out ahead of the game. I like to picture him living to a ripe, rum-sodden old age with enough money in the bank for him to grow old disgracefully. Of course, we'll never really know for certain. What I can tell you is that the rumour, the legend you'll hear all along the South Cornish coast, that he buried all his treasure in a secret, secluded cove down here, but never came back for it. Well, that's just a legend, isn't it? In my professional opinion, there's not a single shred of historical evidence to support that claim. So if you're thinking of popping down here for a peek, you'd be wasting your time. Be seeing you.